During Athens' golden period, Socrates argued about virtue in the agora and Phidias fashioned gods out of marble. At the same time, kids cried in the shadows of the same shiny columns. This isn't the Greece you read about in history books. This is the Greece that classical scholars have long preferred to talk about in footnotes if they ever do. We talk a lot about Greek art, philosophy, and democracy. We admire their efforts to make the world a better place in their search for beauty and truth. But under the facade of cultural progress was a system of exploitation that was so common and ingrained in society that even the smartest people of the time didn't see anything wrong with it. It wasn't just okay to sexually exploit young boys, especially those who were slaves. It became part of the system. These weren't just one-time events or mistakes. This was a pattern of abuse disguised as teaching and mentoring. The Greeks called it pedestry. But no euphemism can hide what it really was, turning children's bodies into goods for rich men to enjoy. As we dig up mass graves of babies that were thrown away and read between the lines of old writings, we have to face a painful truth. The civilization that gave us democracy also created a system of child sexual slavery that lasted for hundreds of years. And maybe the most distressing thing of all is that they convinced themselves and tried to convince history that it was a good thing. This documentary will show you the secret lives of boy concubines in ancient Greece. We will look at how a lack of money, military conquest, and societal hierarchy all came together to make a market for kids. In the limited historical records that mention them, we shall hear the echoes of their pain, and we will wonder how much we are like the people who lived in ancient Athens. For every Plato who wrote about perfect forms, there were many youths whose only goal was to stay alive for another day. We need to hear their tale, not to make the past sound more interesting, but so that we can see exploitation when it looks like civilization. Get ready. It's time to start this trip into the dark parts of history. Every day save festival days, the slave markets in Pius were open. Here, where the salty air combined with the smell of human agony, kids as young as 7 stood on wooden platforms while buyers looked at their teeth, muscles, and potential. But for other boys, those who were thought to be attractive or fragile, a different fate awaited them in the specialized markets that catered to Athens' sexual needs. The economics were harsh in their simplicity. A healthy adult man-slave may sell for 200 dramas, which is around 6 months' pay for a competent laborer. He could get 500 dramas or more for a handsome boy. The most valuable examples, which had fair complexions, symmetrical features, and what the Greeks called proper proportions, could sell for enough to buy a small house. Poverty fueled this business. Families that were starving or in debt would sell their youngest sons to traders who promised them jobs as apprentices or in the home. The truth was much worse. Kidnapping added to the supply, and raiders went for weak towns on the outskirts of Greek control. Pirates roamed the Ion because they knew that some cargo sold for a lot of money in Athens' subterranean markets. The arithmetic behind demographics is mind-blowing. Historians think that at its peak, slaves made between 30 to 40% of the population of Athens. A large number of these were kids and teens. The Greeks kept very detailed records of how much olive oil they made, but they were rather unclear about how many people they owned. It looks like thousands of guys go through this system every year. Schools, which were really training houses, got these kids ready for their jobs. The people who ran it were former courtesans and slaves who were no longer desirable. These places taught the boys how to read poetry, perform music, and do all the little things that would make their future owners happy. They learned how to pour wine with style, when to laugh, and how to deal with what was expected of them in quiet. Last came the branding. A mark burned into the skin, sometimes on the forehead and occasionally on the hand, said that they were property. There were distinct markings on each house. For example, a little delta meant that the house was owned by the state, while private insignia meant that the house was owned by a person. These brands had two purposes: to identify people and to make them feel less human. Under Greek law, a boy was no longer a person after he was marked. He turned into an object, something to be utilized. The trip from child to object was over, and for the people waiting to buy in the agora, morality was just a philosophical exercise, not anything that stopped them from getting what they wanted. The symposium that honored the Greek intellectual life where philosophy began and democracy was argued, held mysteries that most historical chronicles don't include. Yes, these were meetings where smart guys talked about politics, poetry, and what it means to be alive. But these were also places where it was not just okay but expected for enslaved boys to be sexually abused. Imagine the scene. The men's room in a private property in Athens' rich quarter, the Andron, was ready for the evening's meeting. The walls were covered in explicit frescoes that made it clear what the night would hold. Couches were arranged in a square and tables were filled with wine and snacks. The citizen visitors would arrive at dusk, lie down on their designated sofas, and get ready for a night of polite chat. Then the boys showed up. They came in with wine bottles, their young bodies oiled and scented, and wearing short tunics that left little to the imagination. These were the people who served drinks, entertained, and kept the night going. Most of them were between 12 and 18 years old, while several were younger. They glided around the room with practiced grace, filling glasses, answering calls, and putting up with hands that wandered over their bodies with blank looks that showed they had been through a lot of trauma. The way these evenings went on was always the same. As the wine flowed and people's inhibitions faded, what started as a philosophical discussion turned into something much worse. People expected the guys to sing, dance, and do whatever was asked of them. Not doing what you were told meant penalty. Following the rules meant staying alive. The host of the symposia often gave these youngsters as a gift, like how you may offer good wine or fancy food from another country. When modern stories do mention these guys, they do so in passing as if they were as forgettable as the furnishings. Xenophon talks of symposiums where the entertainment featured handsome boys doing acrobatic stunts. Plato's Symposium, a great philosophical work about love, takes place in a gathering like this, although he meticulously cleans out the darker parts. Archaeological proof is less subtle. The pottery and fresco show scenes that make it clear what happened. The words themselves show how commonplace the terror is. Pies, which means boy, came to imply sexual object. Eromenos, the beloved, was a word for a boy who was having intercourse with an older man. The vocabulary used to talk about exploitation was framed in terms of mentorship and love, which let the people involved keep seeing themselves as civilized men while they were abusing others. What happened once the symposium was over and the guests left? The guys went back to their rooms, which were generally small rooms in the home slave area, to wait for the next meeting. Some lucky people would get the lasting love of a rich sponsor who would finally set them free. Most of them just put up with it until they were no longer desirable, at which time they faced an uncertain future as domestic slaves, laborers, or if they had learned their lessons effectively, as the people who found the next generation of victims. This is what really happened at those famous events where democracy was said to have begun. In the same rooms where men talked about justice and virtue, children were in misery, but no one cared because it was just the way things were. In ancient Greece, boys were not just allowed to be sexually exploited. It constructed a whole cultural framework to make it okay and keep it going. This wasn't a secret or something to be ashamed of. It was praised in art, explained in philosophy, and made official in social norms that made it almost hard to resist. The idea of pedesty from Pi's boy and Erastes' lover was dressed up in the language of teaching and learning. Philosophers said that connections between adult males and boys were good and even necessary for a boy to grow up to be a good citizen. Forget that these males were mostly slaves or poor kids who couldn't say no. The Ara's adult lover was said to be helping his eromenos young lover become wise and good. But the truth was much worse. Systematic grooming with the use of social pressure and the law. These rules were supported by art and literature. There are thousands of pieces of pottery from that time that show men with boys in clear scenarios, frequently in schools or sports settings. These weren't kept secret in private collections. They were shown off, given as gifts and used in everyday life. The message was plain. This is how it should be. This is fine. This is the Greek way of life. Poets created poems about how beautiful lads were, comparing them to gods and heroes. Even medical books talked about the right age for boys to start relationships like this, as if abuse could be made better by doctors. The gymnasium, a famous place for Greek education, turned into a hunting ground. The name gymnasium comes from gymnos, which means naked. Wealthy people would watch young men work out naked and choose their targets. The ideal athletic body was a young, strong one, and it became sexualized to the point where lads would grease themselves up not just for sports but also to show off. Trainers often functioned as middlemen, setting up meetings between promising youths and possible customers. Legal arrangements didn't offer any protection. Athenian law said that slaves had no rights. They couldn't go to court, say no to their masters, or get justice for any maltreatment. Even males who were born free and came from poor households had little options. The law technically made it illegal for free-born citizen boys to be prostitutes, but it was rarely enforced, and the penalties were small. There were no rules for slave boys at all. They were property, and the owner could do whatever they wanted with it. Religious activities were another way to take advantage of people. Some cults practiced ritual prostitution, in which boys worked in temples and their bodies were offered to followers as part of religious observance. The cult of Aphrodite at Corinth was known for doing this. In a society where sacred and profane were mixed, abuse was not only okay, it was holy. The philosophical reasons were probably the most dangerous. Plato's dialogue said that love between men and boys was the best kind of love, better than love between men and women. The Stoics, who were known for their self-control, didn't see any problems with using slave boys. Aristotle wrote a lot on ethics and morality, but he held slaves and didn't think it was improper to have sex with enslaved children. Their mental gymnastics would be almost amazing if the results weren't so terrible. This cultural engine worked with brutal efficiency. Every school, church, court, and intellectual group sent the same message. Some boys' bodies were there for the enjoyment of free adult guys. If you questioned this, you were questioning the basic underpinnings of Greek society. And so it went on for generations, a cycle of torture dressed up as civilization. History written by the powerful doesn't always keep the voices of the people who were hurt. We can hear echoes of these boys' lives in court documents, medical writings, graffiti on walls, and even between the lines of literature if we know where to look. Their grief has been heard for thousands of years and needs to be recognized. Court documents from Athens sometimes talk of slaves giving testimony while being tortured, which was the only lawful manner for a slave to do so. A kid named Pitolakos testified in a case from the 4th century BCE concerning abuse in his master's home. The dry legal text says almost in passing that he had been used for sexual pleasure since he was 10 years old. He talked about stealing things in his testimony. His personal wrongdoing was not seen as important to the case. After this one mention, he disappears from history and no one knows what happened to him. Graffiti from Pompeii and other places gives us surprising glimpses into the lives of these youngsters. Messages like, "Crescens the netmaker holds the hearts of all the girls and boys," and more specific descriptions of some males' traits and prices can be found scratched on the walls of brothels and in back alleyways. It looks like some of the graffiti was written by the boys themselves. Messages begging for help from families, rough pictures of home, and attempts to write down their own names before they were completely lost. Medical books show how hard it is for the body. Greek doctors wrote down injuries that were consistent with serial sexual assault, but they did it in a clinical way. Medical papyri regularly talk about treatments for anal fissures, prolapses, and sexually transmitted diseases, and they often mention young slaves by name. One doctor says that these kinds of injuries were typical among boys in the house and suggests different ointments and rest, even though he knows that masters didn't usually give them enough time to heal. The few books that hint at these boys' points of view are painful because they don't come right out and say what they mean. A piece from a forgotten comedy talks about a slave child who pretends to be mute so he doesn't have to appear at symposiums. Another text talks of a boy who cut his own face to make himself less attractive. These are told as funny stories. The pain becomes amusement for the same group of people who caused it. Epitaphs are some of the most powerful proof. Some small grave monuments for slaves say things like, "sweetest boy," or "beloved by his master," euphemisms that probably mean sexual exploitation. One inscription from Athens that really stands out says, "Here lies Nicodemus, who lived 14 years, was beautiful in form, and pleased his master Diodorus in every way." Anyone who wants to see it can see the subtext. The suicide rates could be the most telling. It's hard to get exact numbers, but there are a lot of reports of young slaves killing themselves by jumping from heights, drinking poison, or refusing food. These boys figured out how to go out on their own. One story says that a boy jumped into the sea instead of going back to his master's house. His body washed ashore days later, still wearing the metal collar that showed he was property. Archaeological finds are another type of evidence. Young slaves who were buried in mass graves show symptoms of starvation, untreated injuries, and diseases that are linked to sexual assault. Skeletal examination shows that the bones didn't grow properly, which is a sign of long-term stress and trauma. These bones tell stories that history books try to hide. These boys talk even when they don't say anything. The missing parts of history, the deliberate omissions, the euphemisms, and the topics that ancient writers purposefully avoided all create a negative space that shows how they were hurting. We can learn more from what isn't stated than from what is. The fact that so few direct reports are still around implies that there was a purposeful erasure, a concerted agreement among the literary classes to act like these boys' anguish didn't exist. In ancient Greece, the sexual trafficking of boys was a complex business with its own marketplaces, prices, and supply systems. Learning about the business of exploitation shows how deeply this practice was ingrained in Greek society. This wasn't just a few people acting strangely. It was an entire industry that affected every part of the economy. Most of the big cities in Greece had specialized dealers called paidopoli, kid sellers. These weren't secretive people working in the dark. They were established merchants with stores, regular suppliers, and even trade groups. They had networks that went all the way across the Mediterranean and worked with pirates, raiders, and agents who got lads from poor areas. War brought in extra money. After the military won, thousands of kids rushed the markets, which briefly lowered prices before demand came back. The way the prices are set shows how terrible it is to treat children as commodities. There were some things that boys were judged on. Age younger meant more costs, and there were strict standards for beauty, health, and trainability. Market documents that are still around indicate very detailed ways to group things. A primo lad who is young, attractive, and undamaged may cost as much as a small farm. People who were good at anything like music, dance, or being funny were worth more. They also kept track of and valued things like skin tone, hair color, and the shape of certain body parts. Transportation had its own cruel math. Boys were moved in bunches, and they were typically shackled together aboard ships that were built to make the most money on each trip. There were a lot of deaths during shipment. Crew members' disease, suicide, and abuse took their toll, but the profits were so high that it was okay to lose 20 to 30% of the cargo. The people that made it to their destinations were weak and distraught. Easier to manage. Training facilities served as schools and places to break ground. New arrivals were looked at, sorted, and put through programs that were meant to make them obedient, skilled slaves. To break up families, they used systematic seclusion, punishment for speaking native tongues, and prizes for learning Greek customs quickly. Older slaves, who were often former concubines themselves, were in charge of this. They knew what would be anticipated because they had done it before, so they got the boys ready. The financial ecosystem went beyond just making sales. Lending houses gave people money to buy expensive boys, and the interest rates they charged would have been deemed usurious even in ancient times. Insurance plans protected valued slaves from dying or running away. Lawyers who worked on contracts that lay out the particular terms of use, such as what actions were allowed and what payment was needed if a boy was hurt beyond repair. Rental markets made the exploitation much worse. Not everyone could buy a boy entirely, but a lot of people could rent one for a night or a season. In most Greek cities, brothels that only served boys were open and everyone knew where they were. Private parties may hire lads to come to gatherings with prices based on how many people there were and how long they needed the boys. Some places had membership plans that let people regularly see a different group of boys. The integration with real enterprises was finished. To get more clients, taverns and inns often hired lads. There were boys in theatrical groups who performed on stage and in private. Some religious places even used boy prostitutes to make money, saying it was a service to the gods. The border between legal business and sexual exploitation became so thin that it was impossible to see. In this bad market, competition pushed people to come up with new ideas. Dealers marketed one-of-a-kind items, brought in exotic boys from far-off places, and promised that customers would be happy. Some were experts in certain sorts. Thrian lads were sold as tough and able to last. Egyptians were secretive and good at ancient arts. Gauls were wild and passionate. The wording used in marketing brochures that are still around sounds like cattle catalogs, turning people into lists of their traits and their applications. When boys reached the age when they were no longer desirable, usually in their late teens, their worth dropped quickly. Some were kept as slaves in the home, while others were sold for cheap labor. Some people who learnt the business became procurers themselves, keeping the cycle going. Some masters who really cared about their slaves could set them free, but for a former sex slave in Greek culture, freedom meant a life of shame and little options. This economic machine kept going for hundreds of years, turning thousands of young lives into money. It helped merchants, trainers, transporters, guards, and many other people who made money off of hurting kids. We should remember that the Greek economic miracle was founded on this basis of organized exploitation. Not many lads accepted their fate without a fight, even though they were up against huge power systems meant to shatter their will. Many people discovered methods to resist, stay alive, or create small areas of freedom in their horrible lives. Their stories of defiance, which frequently end in tragedy, remind us that the human spirit always wants to be free, no matter how bad things become. It wasn't uncommon for people to physically fight back, even if it was dangerous. Written records and archaeological data show that boys fought back against their abusers by biting, scratching, and using makeshift weapons. The repercussions for this kind of disobedience were very harsh. Beating, starving, putting people in underground cages by themselves, or cutting them up. One story tells of a youngster who used a kitchen knife to attack his master. As a warning to others, they nailed him on a cross in the courtyard of the house. Still, some chose to fight back violently instead of giving up. More often, sabotage was done in small ways. Boys would destroy valuable things on purpose, ruin wine, or do their jobs badly enough to annoy people but not badly enough to get a harsh punishment. Some learned how to fake being sick. Medical writings say that masters complained about boys who said they had stomach pains or headaches to get out of serving. Some people got skin problems because they didn't take care of their cleanliness on purpose, which made them less appealing for sexual services. There were many different ways that psychological resistance showed up. Some boys made up complex fantasy worlds in their heads that were far different from the real world. Some slaves made covert connections with other slaves, forming fake families that gave them emotional support. They made up secret meeting sites, coded languages, and covert gestures so they could talk freely. In the slave quarters after dark, they told each other stories about their home countries to preserve memories alive that their masters wanted to get rid of. Another way to resist was through religious and spiritual rituals. A lot of lads prayed in secret and kept up with banned rites to stay close to the gods of their homelands. Some people joined mystery cults that claimed to save them in the afterlife. This was a strong hope for people whose current lives were full of pain. Some people believed in philosophical beliefs that stressed inner freedom even when they were physically bound. They found a way to survive mentally in stoic or cynical teachings. The way slaves built networks to protect one another shows how strong they are. Older slaves would occasionally protect younger ones by teaching them how to stay alive and keeping them safe from the worst abuse when they could. Kitchen slaves might make sure that more food got to the boys' room. House slaves would let people know when their owners were in a bad mood. These networks worked through subtle signals and tacit agreements that were hidden from the general public but very important for people inside the system. Some lads survived by using their special skills to get what they wanted. A child with a lovely voice can get better treatment if he agrees to sing at major events. People who were smart and witty were occasionally prized for their speech as much as their physical services. Their mental qualities gave them some security. Some of them even learned how to read and write, which could help them get jobs with more freedom in the future. People kept trying to escape, even if they rarely succeeded. Boys learned how to get around the city, saved up small things they could trade for food, and waited for chances. Most of the people who ran away were caught again immediately. Their tags made it easy to tell who they were, and the rewards for bringing back escaping slaves were considerable. Those who were caught trying to flee faced harsh punishments. More branding, hamstringing to stop future efforts, or sailing to worse circumstances. But knowing what would happen didn't stop desperate boys from trying. There were many ways that the long-term effects of abuse showed up in people's minds. Some boys went completely silent, becoming almost mute. Some people developed what modern psychology would call dissociative disorders, which means they made up different personalities to deal with trauma. People hurt themselves a lot. They hurt themselves by cutting, burning, or doing other things that made them feel like they had some control over their bodies. Many people turned to drink or other drugs when they could get them, hoping to forget. The scars, both physical and mental, stayed with those who made it to maturity. Freed slaves who had been concubines were looked down upon wherever they went. A lot of them could never have healthy relationships. Their ability to trust and be close to others was taken away. Some became abusers themselves, which kept the cycle of violence going. Some people withdrew from society because they couldn't fit in, even when they had the chance. But in all of this darkness, there were times when real humanity shone through. There are still stories about lads who stayed nice, protected younger slaves, and found ways to make things beautiful, even when they were slaves. Some learned to play instruments and write songs that, though they are now lost to history, gave them moments of transcendence. Some people became storytellers, keeping alive stories of better times and locations. These stories of struggle and survival went against the historical narrative that shows these boys as docile victims. They were people who battled in any way they could against a system that was meant to take away their humanity, Their bravery, even when it meant punishment or death, shows that people will always want freedom and dignity. How can we put together the Athens that gave us democracy, philosophy, and the pillars of Western thought with the Athens that routinely tortured children? This cognitive dissonance has caused people to hide the truth about history for hundreds of years. But looking at this contradiction shows significant things about how societies may separate bad things from good things, while still being proud of their own good things. The same city that gave rise to Socrates' moral questions also had slave markets where children were sold like animals. Plato's academy, where the idea of ideal forms was born, was only a few miles from a brothel where boys were forced to work as slaves. Aristotle, who wrote a lot on virtue and the good life, didn't see a problem with holding slaves and thought it was natural to do so. The Parthenon, a symbol of classical beauty and proportion, was erected using money made from human trafficking. It wasn't a lack of knowledge or rudimentary mentality. Greek philosophers could do amazing moral reasoning when they wanted to. They spoke about what was fair, thought about what was good, and came up with quite complex moral frameworks. But they were completely naive to the moral implications of using slaves, especially young ones. They used their intelligence not to criticize the system, but to defend it, coming up with long reasons for why some people were naturally suited for slavery and sexual use. The idea of democracy shows how empty Athenian enlightenment really was. Yes, Athens was the first city to have a democratic government. But this democracy left out women, slaves, and those who lived there but weren't citizens, which was most of the population. The people who had time to spare and met in the agora to talk about policy were sustained by the work and bodies of the enslaved. They were free to study philosophy and politics, but only because other people were slaves. Athenian democracy didn't just happen to have slave boys who were sexually abused. It was a part of society that made it feasible. These contradictions were made worse by cultural production. The same poets who wrote movingly about justice and beauty also composed poems that praised the rape of boys, using the language of love and mentorship to hide the abuse. Sculptors made idealized pictures of young males that were both works of art and ads for sexual exploitation. The theater, where tragedy and comedy were born, often made fun of pedophilia, which made abuse seem normal through humor. Education, which was thought to be the key to Athenian greatness, was a big part of the system. The gymnasium and palestra were places where free males learnt sports and good citizenship. They were also places where they came to regard the sexual exploitation of slaves as normal. Elite education includes going to symposiums where boys saw their enslaved peers being abused, which taught them how to think about how much people are worth. They learned both philosophy and exploitation at the same time, and they didn't find a problem with it. The religious aspect makes the hypocrisy much worse. According to their own mythologies, Greeks worshipped gods who raped mortals all the time. Zeus's conquests, Apollo's pursuit of young men, and other supernatural sexual predations gave people a reason to mistreat others on earth. Sometimes religious celebrations involved ritual prostitution of boys, which made abuse not only okay, but holy. The same civilization that developed the Eleusinian mysteries, which promised spiritual enlightenment, had no problem with killing the spirits of enslaved infants. Greek medicine, which is known for its scientific approach and high moral standards, also failed these youngsters. The Hippocratic Oath says to first do no harm. However, it seems that this didn't apply to treating injuries caused by sexually abusing slaves. Doctors wrote down and treated these kinds of injuries without asking what caused them or spoke out for the victims. Part of the way that medical knowledge grew was by looking at corpses that had been hurt. But this information wasn't used to stop trauma from happening. Even while the legal system included advanced ideas like trial by jury and presumption of innocence, it didn't protect slave boys. Laws about slavery were more concerned with property rights than with human rights. A master who killed his own slave might not get in trouble with the law, but people would look down on him. People didn't even think that raping a slave was a crime. It was property use. The same lawyers who made complicated arguments about justice and good government thought that enslaved children were not protected by the law. People who defend classical civilization nowadays often say that we shouldn't assess ancient societies by today's standards. But this argument comes apart when we remember that even in Greek civilization, some people spoke out against slavery and abuse. The cynics questioned the way society was set up. Some sophists said that all people are basically equal. These minority voices show that moral blindness was a choice, not something that had to happen because of the time. We are still haunted by the residue of this compartmentalization. People have always liked to celebrate cultural successes while disregarding the terrible things that were happening at the same time. How many societies have made wonderful art and literature while also abusing people on a regular basis? How many people have come up with complicated reasons for doing things they knew were wrong? The example of Athens shows us that being culturally advanced and making moral progress are not the same thing. When we look at ancient Greece, we need to remember both of these things at the same time. This civilization had a huge impact on human culture and thought, and it built those successes on a base of terrible exploitation. The youths who were hurt in Athenian brothels and symposiums were just as real as the philosophers in the agora. Their suffering was the cost of other people's knowledge. Recognizing this doesn't make Greek philosophy or democracy any less valuable. It gives us a full picture of how much they really cost. The demise of ancient civilization didn't stop the abuse of children. As we look at modern trafficking, institutional abuse, and the ways that power structures let people prey on others, the similarities with ancient Greece become quite evident. It's not about moral relativism to understand these links. It's about understanding that the ability to mistreat others in a structured way goes beyond time and culture. The worldwide human trafficking industry today makes billions of dollars by taking advantage of weak youngsters. Modern trafficking works through complex networks that buy, move, and sell people, just like slave markets did in ancient Greece. The procedures have changed. Online platforms take the role of real markets. Cryptocurrencies let you make transactions without revealing your identity. But the basic economics stay the same. People with money and influence can take advantage of vulnerable children who are living in extreme poverty, conflict, and social exclusion. The ways that people groomed others in ancient Greece are very similar to how people act when they want to take advantage of someone nowadays. Like Greek philosophers who used the language of mentorship and education to cover up abuse, today's predators often pretend to be benefactors, teachers, or protectors. They find weak targets, like kids who don't have strong family support, people who are having money problems, or people who want to belong, and then they systematically break down the walls that keep them from being used. These strategies are very advanced, which shows that they are learned behaviors that have been passed down through generations of abusers who get better at controlling others. Abusers have always been protected by institutions, even in ancient Greece when there was no way for enslaved children to get help. Churches, schools, sports groups, and the entertainment industry have all put reputation ahead of protecting children many times in the past. The same things that let Greek citizens ignore the pain around them still work today. Willful blindness, financial reasons to be quiet, and the tendency to believe dominant people over weak youngsters. Culture continues to normalize exploitation in ways that are less obvious but nonetheless easy to see. Even though modern countries publicly denounce child abuse, popular culture often makes young people sexual in ways that are similar to what happened in Greece. The way the entertainment business treats child stars, the rise of barely legal pornography, and the continuing stories that blame victims all show old patterns of justification. We might not produce intellectual essays advocating pedophilia, but we do make cultural products that downplay, romanticize, or take advantage of how weak children are. Just like in the past, economic inequality is what makes modern-day exploitation happen. Families in dire situations still have to make tough choices about what will happen to their kids in the future. Traffickers still target refugees and economic migrants. Children are still drawn to exploitation by the promise of education or a chance. The divide in wealth around the world makes sure that there will always be vulnerable children for people who want to take advantage of them. Like slavery made sure there were enough goods in old markets. Legal institutions still don't do a good job of protecting children, even after hundreds of years of alleged progress. Statutes of limitations let abusers get away with their crimes. When it comes to evidence, adult testimony is more important than children's. Sometimes immigration rules treat trafficked children as criminals instead of protecting them as victims. International jurisdictional problems let predators take advantage of holes in the law. Just like ancient Greek tradesmen took use of the different regulations in each city-state, the psychological effects on survival have been the same over time. We can learn a lot about ancient victims from what we know about modern trauma research. Childhood sexual abuse can have long-lasting impacts, such as making it hard to make friends, raising the chance of being abused again, raising the rates of mental illness and substance abuse, and passing trauma down through generations. The boys who made it through Greek symposiums to adulthood probably have the same complicated PTSD, dissociative disorders, and relationship problems that survivors today do. Digital technology has opened up new opportunities for people to take advantage of others that are similar to old systems in troubling ways. Online channels make it easier than ever for anyone to sell and share abusive material. This would have shocked traffickers in the past. Cryptocurrency and encrypted messages provide you the same privacy that being far away used to give you. Live streaming of abuse lets people take advantage of it in real time across continents. A technology conference where people may see abuse happen from the safety of their own homes. The fact that ordinarily moral people are complicit is nevertheless a distressing fact. Like Greek philosophers who could separate their morals to leave out imprisoned children, modern consumers take part in institutions that take advantage of kids. By using child labor and supply networks, by making porn that makes it hard to tell if someone is consenting or not, and by ignoring clear symptoms of abuse in their communities. People are still able to make excuses for taking part in systems that take advantage of them. But there are also important differences that give us hope. Children's rights are now seen as human rights by modern international law. Survivor advocacy groups speak up for people who have been quieted in the past. Technology that makes it possible to exploit people also makes it possible to find and punish those who do. In ways that were unfathomable in ancient times, global awareness campaigns have made protecting children a top priority. The question yet stands: are we different enough from ancient Athens? Have we really changed, or have we just found better ways to mask abuse? Will future historians find the same paradoxes in our time? Amazing things done combined with systemic maltreatment of the weak. The fact that child trafficking, institutional abuse, and the normalization of teenage exploitation in culture still happen shows that even though the forms have changed, people are still capable of doing evil. We don't have a moral edge over ancient Greece. We have a historical edge. We can see how they made the wrong things seem right. The hard part is using that same critical eye on our own society to figure out where we are allowing exploitation to happen by what we do or don't do. The lads who endured in ancient Greece deserve more than just being remembered in history. Their pain should educate us to be careful of the systems that cause it. For more than 2,000 years, the systemic sexual abuse of boys in ancient Greece has been downplayed, idealized, or even overlooked in our narrative of classical history. This last test explores why this quiet has lasted so long and what breaking it means for how we think about the past and the present. The cleaning started nearly right away. Even while Roman writers borrowed a lot from Greek writers, they didn't like how blatant Greek pederasty was. Early Christian writers spoke out against the practice, but they often did so in ways that blamed the victims as much as the people who did it. Scholars in the Middle Ages who rediscovered Greek texts left out or translated incorrectly parts that had sexual content. During the Renaissance, when Greek culture was seen as the basis of Western civilization, admitting that children were often abused would have made that story more problematic. There was a lot of bad historical revisionism in the 18th and 19th centuries. As European countries justified their own imperialism by claiming that their cultures were better than others, Greek pederasty was redefined as noble mentorship. Victorian historians did linguistic acrobatics to make Greek words that were manifestly sexual less sexual. Museums kept Greek erotic ceramics in distinct secret collections that only educated men could see and enjoy fully. People admitted to and rejected the abuse at the same time, making it clear but not seen. The fact that academics are involved in this silence shows how power structures affect history. Classicists, who were mostly men and elite until recently, had both personal and professional reasons to downplay this part of Greek society. If they admitted that child sexual abuse was a big problem in Greek society, it would ruin the classical education that helped them get their jobs. Even now, a lot of classical study schools ignore this fact, focusing on philosophy and democracy and considering systemic abuse as an unfortunate aside. The price of this quiet goes well beyond being accurate in history. By not fully recognizing how much these boys are suffering, we keep up traditions of downplaying that hurt people today. When we say that Greece was a glorious period of reason and beauty without looking at its violent history, we are saying that cultural success can make up for human pain. This lesson is important for all modern institutions that put their reputation ahead of protecting children. It's not enough to just admit that abuse happened to break this silence. It asks us to put the victims' experiences at the center of our understanding of Greek society. In every philosophical discussion, there was a spot where enslaved boys might be called upon for sexual purposes. There were many people in assembly who owned child sex slaves during every democratic debate. Every piece of art was made in workshops where young apprentices were always at risk of being abused. This situation doesn't take away from the intellectual accomplishments, but it does make us think about what we mean by civilization. The effects go beyond how we read classical texts. We need to keep in mind that Plato's idealized relationships were between adult males and young boys when he writes about love and beauty. When Aristotle puts people into groups, we have to deal with how he justifies slavery. We should examine whose pain their poems hid when writers praise the beauty of youth. To read classics responsibly, you have to read them all the way through and recognize both the good and the bad. People who were sexually abused as children in the past should not have to deal with people forgetting how long these patterns have been around. Knowing that strong civilizations have always found methods to take advantage of children backs up what survivors of institutional betrayal are going through now. Knowing that abusers have always come up with complicated excuses helps us find similar language now. We can only use history to stop things from happening if we are honest about what it says. It's evident what the challenge is for today's society. What moral blindness would future generations see in us if we can now understand how morally blind ancient Greece was? Where are we letting abuse happen on a large scale while we celebrate our personal growth? Which of our institutions are protecting predators? What pain are we lessening by using euphemisms and leaving things out? We can't save the boys of ancient Greece, but knowing what they went through can help us save kids today. This documentary has taken you through the dark parts of classical culture, showing you truths that scholars have chosen to ignore for hundreds of years. We've heard echoes of boys whose voices were stifled, looked at the systems that took advantage of them, and followed the effects of that exploitation all the way to the current day. The challenge now is what we do with this knowledge. It's not simply about the past, it's about seeing patterns that last throughout time. Sexual assault of minors in ancient Greece wasn't unusual. It was just one illustration of how power structures always let people take advantage of the weak. Every culture makes its own versions of symposiums and slave markets, as well as its own philosophical reasons for doing things that are wrong. We need to find and take apart these structures in our own time. There aren't many direct records of the boys who suffered in ancient Greece, but their anguish is a warning that has lasted through time. They remind us that civilization isn't about how well buildings are built or how deep philosophical ideas are, but about how well a society respects its weakest members. By that standard, classical Greece was a total failure, and we should judge ourselves based on it. This is the end of their story. But we have to start taking responsibility. The patterns of ancient Greece are still there in every child at danger today, in every institution that puts its own authority ahead of protection, and in every cultural story that downplays abuse. We can't change what happened to those lads, but we can make sure that their pain wasn't for nothing. We can speak up, name the abuse, and strive for a society where no child has to go through what they did. Remember them, learn from them, and let their voices that have been silenced lead us to justice.